Before there were mighty kingdoms, glittering capitals, and armies marching to secure borders, there was only the land. Vast, silent, and unforgiving, the great expanse of Asia stretched endlessly, a world of deserts, mountains, steppes, and winding rivers that carried whispers of life across barren reaches. Long before empires claimed dominion, men and women sought paths through this immensity, carrying not only goods but also stories, faiths, and hopes. This was the early Silk Road, though no one at the time would have called it that. To those who risked their lives upon it, it was a path of both promise and peril, a ribbon of survival etched across landscapes that seemed to resist human ambition. The caravans were small in those early days. Traders from China, Persia, India, and the scattered oases of Central Asia loaded their camels with silk, jade, spices, and horses. They moved slowly, in patient rhythm with the harsh demands of terrain and climate. Each step forward felt like a gamble against fate. A desert storm could swallow an entire caravan without leaving a trace. A single band of raiders could undo years of work and preparation. Disease spread easily when men and animals lived so closely in unforgiving conditions. Yet despite the dangers, men continued to walk and ride across the sands, drawn by the possibility that what lay beyond the horizon was worth the risk. At night, the sky unfolded above them like an endless ocean of stars. The desert cooled, silence settling so thick it seemed almost sacred. Traders huddled by small fires, exchanging not only food but also tales from their homelands. A Persian might speak of great kings and fire temples, an Indian might whisper the teachings of wandering monks, a Chinese merchant might describe the elegance of silk weaving or the power of the Han court. In these conversations, knowledge traveled faster than goods, weaving unseen bonds between cultures still strangers to one another. The Silk Road, even in its infancy, was more than a route of commerce, it was a corridor of human imagination. But nothing about this early network was secure. Routes shifted constantly, depending on political winds, local alliances, and the will of nature itself. If a war erupted in a valley, traders sought another pass. If a river dried, a detour through harsher terrain became necessary. This fragility meant that every journey was uncertain. A man might set out from the valleys of China with hope and return years later, broken and empty-handed, or perhaps not return at all. Yet others might come back rich, carrying with them treasures unknown in their homelands, their names spoken with or in markets where fortune was worshipped as fiercely as gods. To picture the early Silk Road is to imagine contrasts so sharp they almost hurt the mind. A glowing oasis city surrounded by endless wasteland, the warmth of a caravan fire against the cold bite of mountain winds, the delicate shimmer of silk unrolled in a dusty desert tent. These contrasts gave the road its character, filling every journey with both wonder and fear. The people who walked it were not yet backed by great states or powerful empires. They relied instead on fragile networks of trust, small communities of traders, and the occasional protection of local chieftains who demanded payment in exchange for safe passage. Some of these local powers grew wealthy simply by controlling water. A single well in the desert could mean life or death for entire caravans. Those who guarded these oases became gatekeepers of the Silk Road, charging tolls in gold, goods, or loyalty. Travelers understood this unspoken rule: no one crossed the desert alone. Without local knowledge, without alliances, a caravan was doomed. The very fragility of these arrangements made the dream of a centralized power, an empire to watch over the trade, to guarantee its safety, to impose order on chaos, so alluring. But in these earlier centuries, that dream was still far away. The goods that moved along these routes tell a story of longing. Silk, shimmering with light, fascinated distant kingdoms that had never seen such delicate threads. Spices carried the flavors of unseen lands, their scents clinging to traders' robes long after the goods were sold. Precious stones, lapis from Afghanistan, jade from China, glittered like pieces of captured sky. Horses bred on the steppes carried with them the thunder of battle, prized as much for war as for prestige. Every item carried across those vast lands was more than just a commodity. It was a symbol of connection, proof that the world was larger than any one kingdom or tribe could imagine. Still, the early Silk Road was as much about ideas as it was about objects. Stories traveled with the caravans, legends of distant lands where rivers flowed with gold, tales of cities so vast they swallowed the horizon. Philosophies and beliefs also began their quiet journey. Early seeds of Buddhism moved westward, carried by monks who followed the same paths as traders. In the other direction, whispers of Zoroastrian fire rituals and Mesopotamian myths reached the ears of Chinese travelers. Each step along the road was a step into cultural transformation, though most who walked it could not have known how far these ideas would spread. And yet, despite all the beauty and promise, danger never loosened its grip. Raiders haunted the deserts, striking swiftly and disappearing like ghosts into the sands. Wolves and bandits prowled mountain passes, waiting for stragglers. Even nature itself seemed hostile: sudden floods in river valleys, snowstorms in high passes, burning heat under a merciless sun. Traders learned to walk lightly, to respect the land, and to never take survival for granted. Their journals, where they existed, spoke not in triumph but in awe at the forces they endured. It was this constant tension, between promise and danger, wealth and ruin, that defined the Silk Road before empires rose. It was a place of fragile connections, where a single caravan's journey could change the fate of entire families, yet where nothing could be relied upon for long. Listeners must imagine this world as twilight, a liminal space where cultures brushed against one another but had not yet intertwined, where trade moved like water through cracks, seeking channels but never yet bound by stone. In this uncertain landscape, the stage was set for transformation. For centuries, men and women endured the risks, walking paths that seemed to vanish and reappear with every shift of fortune. But slowly, inevitably, the idea grew that such a road could not remain lawless forever. The Silk Road cried out for order, for guardianship, for a power strong enough to tame the wilderness and bind together East and West. That power had not yet arrived, but its shadow was already forming at the edges of the horizon. The forgotten empire that would one day rise to control these paths did not emerge from nothing. It was born out of this chaos, this fragility, and this eternal human hunger to reach beyond the horizon. For now, the Silk Road before empires was like a dream, beautiful, perilous, fleeting. It was a world of stars reflected in desert sands, of goods glimmering in firelight, of footsteps that vanished in the wind. A world poised on the brink of greatness, waiting for the guardians who would come. If history is a river, then geography is its bed, the shape and channel that determine where the waters must flow. Nowhere is this truer than in Central Asia, the heartland through which the Silk Road wound its way like a living vein. To understand why a forgotten empire could rise and control the trade between East and West, one must first understand the land itself, a landscape both merciless and generous, both hostile and irresistibly strategic. Stretching between towering mountain ranges and vast deserts, Central Asia was not simply a backdrop for history, it was the stage itself, sculpting the movements of people, armies, and caravans. To the north lay the endless steppes, grasslands that seemed to roll forever under the sky, home to nomadic horsemen whose mobility made them both traders and raiders. To the south, deserts like the Taklamakan and the Gobi stretched wide, seas of shifting sands where survival depended on the fragile chain of oases. To the east, the mighty wall of China stood, marking the frontier of one of the world's most enduring civilizations. To the west, the fertile crescent of Persia and the Mediterranean beckoned, lands rich with cities, kings, and stories. Central Asia was the bridge, yet not a simple one. It was a labyrinth of routes, each dictated by the geography that made or broke human ambition. Consider the mountains. The Pamirs, sometimes called the roof of the world, rose like a fortress of stone, their passes covered in snow that lingered long after winter had passed. The Tian Shan, jagged and vast, carved the horizon into peaks and valleys. The Hindu Kush, formidable and nearly impassable, guarded the approaches from India and Afghanistan. These ranges were obstacles, yes, but they were also guardians of paths. Traders had to find their way through narrow passes where snow, avalanches, and sudden storms could wipe away the unprepared. Yet these very mountains, daunting though they were, became gates of destiny. Whoever held them could control the flow of caravans. Whoever mastered the passes became not just a ruler of land but a ruler of movement, a lord of connection itself. Then there were the deserts. The Taklamakan, whose very name is said to mean you go in, but you do not come out, stretched across western China in a vast ocean of sand. Caravans skirting its edges knew the risk of wandering even a little too far. The Gobi, colder and more stony, tested travelers with bitter winds and extremes of temperature. Crossing these expanses was like crossing the threshold of another world. To survive, caravans relied on the lifeblood of the Silk Road, the oases. Kasha, Khotan, Samarkand, Bukhara, names that would become legendary, each an island of life in the desert seas. Wells, rivers, and fertile patches of land turned these places into natural gathering points, where traders could rest, resupply, and exchange goods. Geography itself demanded that all roads converge upon them, and so they blossomed into centers of wealth and power. Imagine a caravan descending from the icy heights of a mountain pass, its camels laden with silk, its men weary from snow and altitude. Below, a green patch glimmers in the distance, the promise of water and shade. The relief would be overwhelming, the oasis a miracle in the wilderness. Yet these places were not gifts, they were prizes. Whoever controlled them could demand tribute from every caravan that passed. Geography had given them natural power, but human ambition would transform that power into wealth, and wealth into empires. The rivers, too, shaped destiny. The Oxus, known today as the Amu Doria, and the Syr Doria carved fertile valleys through otherwise arid lands. Around them, civilizations could grow crops, sustain livestock, and build towns. These rivers became anchors of stability in a world otherwise defined by movement. Control of their banks meant control of food, trade, and armies. It is no coincidence that many forgotten empires of the Silk Road rose in these river valleys. The land itself invited them. Yet geography was not only about opportunity, it was also about vulnerability. The openness of the steppes allowed nomadic horsemen to appear suddenly, strike swiftly, and vanish like ghosts. Mountains that protected also isolated. Deserts that funneled caravans also trapped them. Geography was never a silent partner, it was an active force, demanding adaptation and shaping the destiny of those who dared to live upon it. This is why Central Asia became the crossroads of the world. It was not simply that trade routes passed through by chance. It was that no other land could so forcefully command the flow of people and goods. To move silk from China to Persia, one had to pass here. To carry glassware from Rome to the east, one had to cross these valleys. The geography left no alternative. It funneled humanity through narrow corridors, like a mighty hand guiding history itself. And it was not only goods that traveled. Languages mingled here, shaped by the terrain. In a single market, one might hear Chinese, Persian, Indian dialects, Turkic tongues, and the guttural speech of nomadic tribes. Religions, too, were shaped by geography, carried by the same rivers, passes, and oases that bore silk and spices. The land was not neutral, it was a crucible where human diversity melted together, forged into something new. To fully grasp the power of geography, one must picture contrasts once again. In the east, the Great Wall loomed, built to keep nomads at bay, a man-made answer to a geographic challenge. In the west, Persia's fertile plains stretched wide, watered by rivers and blessed with cities. Between them, the deserts, mountains, and steppes stood like tests placed by nature itself. Any empire that hoped to rise here had to solve the riddle of the land. It had to learn when to move and when to stand still, when to bow to geography and when to defy it. Those who failed disappeared, their ruins swallowed by sand and time. Those who succeeded carved their names, even if only briefly, into the stone of history. This forgotten empire, whose story we are unraveling, owed its very existence to geography. It did not arise randomly, it was shaped by necessity, by opportunity, by the unchanging logic of terrain. Its cities flourished at crossroads, its rulers grew rich on oases, its armies guarded mountain passes, and its merchants navigated deserts by the stars. Geography offered no mercy, but it offered something far greater, inevitability. The empire that rose here was not an accident of human ambition alone, it was the answer to the questions the land itself asked. To close your eyes and imagine this geography is to imagine a map painted in extremes, endless sands broken by green islands, mountains that scrape the heavens, rivers that shimmer like silver threads through parched earth. It is to see history before it happened, to feel why empires would rise, why trade would flow, and why this land could never be ignored. The Silk Road did not merely pass through Central Asia, it was born of it, shaped by it, and bound to it forever. Geography is destiny. In Central Asia, that destiny was to become the center of the ancient world, the beating heart of exchange between civilizations. It was here, in this landscape of deserts, mountains, and oases, that forgotten empires took root, guarding and commanding the flow of the world's most precious goods. Without this geography, the Silk Road would not have existed. Without the Silk Road, history itself would have taken a different course. And so, before we speak of kings and armies, of merchants and monks, we must remember that the true architect of the Silk Road was not man, but the land itself. It was the land that dictated where men could travel, where cities could rise, and where empires could fall. It was the land that held the key to power, a key that only a few forgotten rulers ever managed to grasp. Their story begins here, written first not in ink, but in stone, sand, and sky. Every empire begins as a whisper before it becomes a roar. The forgotten power that would one day control the Silk Road was no exception. It rose not from the fertile plains of a great river civilization nor from the towering walls of an ancient capital, but from the margins, from the quiet strength of merchants, nomads, and small city-states that learned to thrive in a land where survival was never guaranteed. Its beginning was not marked by triumphant declarations or monumental palaces, but by resilience, ambition, and the subtle weaving together of many different peoples under one vision. The story begins in scattered oases, where the dust of the desert met the green of cultivated fields. These were places like Samarkand and Bukhara, small at first, little more than markets and watering stations on the edge of survival. But within their walls, something was growing. Traders from China arrived with silk, drawn westward by demand. From India came caravans with spices, precious gems, and the teachings of wandering monks. From Persia and the Mediterranean world flowed fine glass, textiles, and coins stamped with the faces of kings long dead. These places were crossroads before they were kingdoms, and at the heart of their market stood the men who would one day shape an empire, the Sogdians. The Sogdians were merchants above all else. Unlike conquering armies or dynastic rulers, they built power not with swords but with contracts, negotiations, and the trust of networks stretching across continents. They spoke multiple languages, navigated the harshest terrain, and knew how to deal with rulers as easily as with nomadic chieftains. Slowly, their wealth grew, and with it their influence. Coins clinked in their markets, silks fluttered in their stalls, and stories from distant lands filled the air. Yet wealth alone was not enough. To control trade, one needed security, and to achieve security, one needed power. At first, this power was subtle. It came in the form of alliances with local tribes, payments to ensure caravans passed safely, and the construction of fortified caravanserais, resting places where travelers could eat, sleep, and pray. Slowly, these protective measures gave way to something larger. The Sogdian elites, with their wealth and their networks, began to organize not just for trade but for rule. They saw what geography had offered them, the crossroads of the world, and they recognized that whoever mastered these crossroads could command a fortune greater than gold. The Silk Road in those days was fragile. Wars between distant empires could interrupt its flow. Bandits could undo months of travel in a single ambush. But where larger empires saw a distant frontier, the Sogdians saw opportunity. They became intermediaries, the invisible glue binding east and west. They were not soldiers, yet their caravans moved like armies, disciplined, organized, relentless. They were not kings, yet their wealth gave them authority that rivaled monarchs. Out of this strange balance of fragility and resilience, a hidden power was born. Imagine walking through one of their early markets. You would hear the bleating of camels being loaded for distant journeys, the sharp calls of merchants bargaining, the jingling of ornaments from India, the rich smell of spices hanging heavy in the air. In a single stall, silk from China might lie beside silverware from Persia. A Buddhist monk, his robes faded by dust, might pass a Nestorian Christian priest speaking softly to a caravan guard. These were not just markets, they were living museums of human culture, alive with energy, tension, and possibility. The rulers who rose from these places understood this deeply. They recognized that control of goods was control of destiny. Yet what makes their rise remarkable is that it was not fueled by conquest in the traditional sense. They did not sweep across the land with armies, destroying and rebuilding in their image. Instead, they grew by embedding themselves in the fabric of trade. Their strength was not the sword but the contract, not destruction but connection. And yet, over time, this web of influence began to resemble something more than commerce. It became governance. It became the beginnings of empire. To outsiders, this hidden power may have seemed fragile. It lacked the towering walls of Rome, the armies of Persia, or the bureaucratic machinery of China. But appearances deceived. In truth, this empire of merchants commanded something greater than military strength. They commanded the loyalty of caravans, the trust of distant courts, and the wealth that flowed like rivers of gold through their cities. When a caravan set out from Chang'an in China, destined for the West, its safety and success often depended not on the soldiers of great kings but on the quiet arrangements made by these merchant rulers in the heart of Central Asia. There was, however, an irony to their rise. The very qualities that gave them power, flexibility, adaptability, invisibility, also made them easy to forget. History often celebrates conquerors who carve their names into stone with blood and steel. It forgets those who built empires from negotiation and trade. And so, while their cities flourished, while their influence stretched across deserts and mountains, their story was slowly overshadowed by the mightier, louder empires at their borders. But in truth, without them, the Silk Road would never have functioned. Their rise was quiet, but it was not accidental. The Sogdians and their neighbors understood geography, understood the fragility of the routes, and understood human desire. They positioned themselves as indispensable. Kings might rise and fall in Persia, dynasties might change in China, nomadic tribes might sweep across the steppes, but always, the caravans needed to pass through the crossroads. Always, the merchants of these cities were there to guide them. In that constancy lay power greater than armies, a power that endured for centuries. As the forgotten empire took shape, its people began to invest in monuments and temples, in art and language. They were no longer just merchants but patrons of culture. Their wealth funded religious shrines where Buddhism, Zoroastrianism, and even early Christianity found homes side by side. Their influence spread not only through goods but also through the ideas they carried and shared. The empire they built was not defined by walls or weapons, but by connection, by the weaving together of distant worlds into one tapestry. And so, from humble oases and scattered markets, from caravans that braved deserts and mountains, from the resilience of merchants who refused to be silenced by geography or danger, the hidden power was born. An empire of trade, of culture, of influence so subtle it often escaped notice, yet so vital that the Silk Road itself would not have survived without it. Its birth was not sudden, not dramatic, but inevitable, shaped by geography, necessity, and human ambition. This was the beginning of the forgotten empire, the quiet force that would one day rise to command the lifeline of the ancient world. Not by conquest alone, but by becoming the invisible bridge between civilizations, it claimed its place in history, even if that place would one day be buried in silence and sand. To imagine the Silk Road at its height is to imagine a web spun across the face of the earth, delicate yet unbreakable, stretching from the palaces of China to the harbors of the Mediterranean. At the center of this web, holding the threads together, sat the forgotten empire, quietly orchestrating one of the greatest movements of goods, ideas, and cultures in human history. It was not only the wealth of nations that traveled along these roads but also the longings of civilizations, the very dreams of kings and merchants alike. The web was vast, but it did not sprawl randomly. It followed the logic of geography and the decisions of human need. From the east, caravans set out from the Chinese capital of Chang'an, their loads heavy with silk, porcelain, lacquerware, and paper. These caravans threaded their way through the treacherous Gobi and Taklamakan deserts, following narrow corridors marked by oases where life clung stubbornly to the edge of survival. Here, at these oases, the forgotten empire stood waiting, ready to receive, redistribute, and protect the flow of goods. The Silk Road was not a single road but a network of arteries, and this empire acted as the heart that kept the lifeblood moving. Silk was the most famous of all the treasures. To the Romans, it was a miracle, cloth so fine it seemed to shimmer with captured moonlight. They believed it must grow from the trees of distant lands, for they could not imagine the silkworms of China patiently spinning their threads. Silk robes became the mark of nobility, desired so intensely that emperors worried about the moral corruption it might bring. But silk was only one thread of the web. Spices traveled westward: cinnamon and cardamom from India, pepper from the Malabar coast, saffron from Persia. Each grain, each leaf, carried with it not only flavor but also stories of faraway lands. From the west came treasures equally coveted. Glassware from Roman workshops gleamed in the bazaars of Central Asia, its transparency a marvel to those who had never seen such delicate artistry. Woolen textiles, fine wines, and coins stamped with the images of emperors made their way eastward, symbols of empires whose power stretched beyond the horizon. Horses from the steppes, bred for strength and speed, became prized gifts, their hooves echoing across mountain passes and deserts alike. Gems, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, rubies from India, jade from China, glittered in the markets, each stone a fragment of the earth transformed into wealth. Yet the web of trade was never simply about objects. It was about movement, of people, ideas, and culture. A single caravan might carry not only silk and spices but also scholars, musicians, monks, and healers. Alongside merchants walked translators, storytellers, and artisans. In their hands, the Silk Road became not just an exchange of goods but a symphony of human voices. Languages blended in the air of marketplaces, creating new dialects and ways of speaking. Music traveled with instruments tucked into saddlebags, lutes, flutes, and drums that found new homes far from their places of origin. Art styles mixed, motifs of Indian lotus flowers appearing in Persian murals, Chinese dragons winding their way into Central Asian tapestries. The forgotten empire thrived because it understood this web better than any of its rivals. Where others sought to dominate through conquest, this empire sought to connect. It secured the caravan routes, taxed the goods, and offered protection where none had existed before. Traders came to trust its cities as safe havens. In Samarkand, Kasha, and Bukhara, caravans could rest, their animals watered, their goods tallied, their contracts written. Caravanserais, fortified in spaced a day's journey apart, offered beds, meals, and security. These structures, built by rulers of the forgotten empire, were not merely shelters but symbols of order in a chaotic world. Without them, the Silk Road would have remained a dream too dangerous to pursue. The web of trade also had a rhythm, a seasonal heartbeat. In spring and autumn, caravans set out, avoiding the extremes of summer heat and winter storms. Journeys were long, sometimes stretching across years. A merchant might leave home never knowing if he would return, his fate tied to the whims of weather, politics, and health. Yet still they came, driven by the lure of profit and the hope of discovery. To walk the Silk Road was to walk a tightrope between fortune and ruin, and the forgotten empire became the net beneath it, ensuring that risk, while never eliminated, could at least be managed. One must imagine the sensory richness of these exchanges to grasp their power. A caravan arriving in a bustling Silk Road city would be greeted by the scent of spices heavy in the air, the clamor of bargaining voices rising from crowded markets, the shimmer of fabrics hung in dazzling displays. Camels groaned under their loads, their bells jingling as they shuffled through narrow streets. Children darted between stalls, laughing as they caught fragments of foreign songs. Merchants haggled, priests offered blessings, and officials of the empire recorded the flow of wealth with careful hands. It was a scene both chaotic and beautiful, alive with the pulse of human ambition. But not all threads of the web were visible. Ideas traveled silently, weaving themselves into the minds of travelers and settlers. From India came Buddhism, carried by monks who walked the same roads as merchants, their temples rising near caravan routes as places of rest and reflection. From Persia came the fire worship of Zoroastrians, their temples glowing at night with eternal flames. Christianity, in its Nestorian form, spread eastward, while later, Islam would follow the same paths, carried by merchants as much as by missionaries. The empire at the heart of the Silk Road became a place where faiths mingled, where no single creed could claim supremacy, because the very web itself resisted uniformity. Knowledge, too, was exchanged. Astronomers shared their charts, physicians their remedies, mathematicians their numbers. Paper, invented in China, made its way west, transforming the way knowledge was stored and shared. Without the steady flow of this web, the Renaissance centuries later might never have occurred, for the seeds of that awakening were sown in the markets and libraries of the Silk Road. And at the center of this quiet revolution stood the forgotten empire, ensuring that these fragile threads reached their destinations. Yet for all its wealth, the web was fragile. A single war could sever roots, a drought could empty oases, a plague could silence markets. The forgotten empire understood this and built its strength not on the illusion of permanence but on adaptability. When one route faltered, another was opened. When danger grew in one valley, caravans were redirected through another. This flexibility, born of necessity, gave the empire its resilience. It was never about controlling every path but about ensuring that the web as a whole remained unbroken. For centuries, the web of trade bound together worlds that might otherwise have remained strangers. A Roman senator draping himself in silk unknowingly honored the labor of Chinese peasants. A Buddhist statue carved in Central Asia bore the influence of Greek art, a legacy of Alexander's empire centuries earlier. A Persian glass cup might find itself in the hands of a Chinese noble, its craftsmanship admired as though it were divine. Each object, each idea, carried across deserts and mountains, testified to the invisible power of the Silk Road. And behind it all, guiding and protecting, stood the forgotten empire, rarely celebrated, often overlooked, yet essential to the story of human connection. The web they maintained was more than trade. It was civilization itself, stretched across continents, fragile yet enduring. To walk its threads was to touch the edge of the known world, to step into the unknown, to become part of something greater than oneself. And for those who listened closely, the hum of that web was the hum of destiny, whispered across sands and steppes, reminding all who passed that they were part of a story that transcended their own lives. This was the web of trade, and without it, the Silk Road would have been no more than scattered paths in a harsh wilderness. With it, the ancient world became connected, alive, and forever changed. The forgotten empire, hidden in the heart of Central Asia, had woven its influence into every strand, unseen yet indispensable, silent yet eternal. In the vast expanse of deserts, mountains, and windswept plains that made up the Silk Road, the cities of the forgotten empire shone like constellations. They were not mere clusters of stone and wood but dazzling beacons of human ambition, artistry, and exchange. Travelers spoke of them with awe, as though they were half real and half dream, cities where the dust of caravans gave way to streets alive with color, where the smell of spices lingered in the air like incense, and where the light of learning burned as brightly as the lamps in the night markets. These were the cities of light and shadow, where prosperity and peril lived side by side, shaping the destiny of both merchants and monarchs. Foremost among them was Samarkand, a city whose very name became a synonym for splendor. Rising from the arid steppe, it was encircled by strong walls that protected its bustling heart. Entering through its gates, a weary traveler would find himself in a place that seemed to defy the surrounding wilderness. Markets spilled into the streets, their stalls laden with silk, jade, lapis lazuli, and finely woven carpets. Artisans bent over their work, carving ivory, hammering bronze, or painting delicate miniatures on parchment. The voices of dozens of languages filled the air, a cacophony of bargaining and laughter, punctuated by the bray of donkeys and the hiss of cooking fires. Samarkand was more than a market, however, it was a center of learning and faith. Here, Buddhist monasteries stood beside Zoroastrian fire temples and later, mosques that echoed with the prayers of new generations. Libraries housed manuscripts carried across deserts, while observatories studied the heavens, mapping stars that guided caravans across the night. For those who passed through, Samarkand offered more than safety and trade, it offered the sense of belonging to something greater, a world in which cultures intertwined and differences became strengths. Not far away, Bukhara thrived as another jewel of the empire. If Samarkand dazzled with its wealth and artistry, Bukhara exuded a quieter, more contemplative power. Known for its scholars and poets, it became a city where words carried as much weight as gold. The recitation of verses, the copying of manuscripts, and the teaching of philosophy gave Bukhara its enduring aura. Travelers described evenings where lanterns lit the courtyards, and voices rose in debates about the nature of the soul, the movement of planets, and the duties of rulers. To enter Bukhara was to step into a city where knowledge itself was currency, exchanged freely among those eager to understand the world and their place within it. Kasha, further east, sat at the crossroads of empires. Nestled near the edge of the Taklamakan Desert, it was a place of arrival and departure, the threshold between China and Central Asia. Here, the harsh realities of travel became starkly visible. Caravans staggered into Kasha with their animals half dead from thirst and their merchants weary from sandstorms. Yet within the city, life thrived. Its bazaars overflowed with goods, silks from China, spices from India, furs from the northern forests, and silver from Persia. Kasha's streets were narrow and twisting, its buildings constructed of mud brick that glowed in the sun's light and turned cool in the evening shade. It was a city of survival, a place where the shadows of the desert pressed close, yet the brilliance of human resilience shone all the brighter. Each of these cities carried both light and shadow. Their walls gave protection, but they also enclosed intrigue and danger. Wealth drew envy, and the promise of safety attracted those who would exploit it. Bandits hovered at the edges of caravan routes, and rival empires coveted the riches that flowed through the streets. Even within the cities, corruption could fester. Officials demanded bribes, merchants cheated customers, and the weight of taxation fell heavily on the poor. For every glittering palace, there was a crowded alley where beggars sought scraps. For every scholar who copied a manuscript, there was a child who went hungry, watching the wealth of the Silk Road pass them by. The forgotten empire managed this delicate balance by weaving together law, diplomacy, and force. Caravanserais, positioned just beyond city gates, served not only as rest stops but also as instruments of control, where guards inspected goods and ensured that taxes were paid. Watchtowers lined the approaches to major cities, their fires sending signals that could summon reinforcements in times of danger. Within the cities, marketplaces were regulated with surprising efficiency. Prices were monitored, weights and measures standardized, and contracts written with care. These systems gave merchants confidence, for they knew that here, at least, the shadows were kept in check by the steady hand of authority. But even the most carefully guarded cities could not escape the unpredictability of fate. Fires swept through crowded districts, reducing homes and shops to ashes. Plagues arrived with travelers, spreading sickness faster than physicians could heal. Political upheavals toppled rulers, throwing once thriving centers into chaos. In these moments, the fragility of the Silk Road revealed itself. The same roads that carried wealth could also carry destruction, and the same empire that promised stability could become vulnerable in an instant. And yet, despite these challenges, the cities endured. They endured because they were more than mere economic hubs. They were living archives of human aspiration. In their architecture, one could see the blending of cultures, domes influenced by Persia, columns inspired by Greece, motifs borrowed from India and China. In their stories, one could hear the echoes of countless travelers who had passed through, leaving behind fragments of themselves. A merchant's tale told in a tea house might inspire a young listener to journey eastward. A song heard in a crowded market might take root in a new land. The cities absorbed these gifts, transformed them, and sent them outward again, like stars shedding light into the night. For the weary traveler on the Silk Road, the moment of entering one of these cities must have felt like stepping into another world. Imagine walking after weeks across barren terrain, your lips cracked from thirst, your clothes stiff with dust. Then, rising before you, the walls of Samarkand, glinting in the sun, promising rest. Within, the streets alive with voices, the cool shade of trees in hidden courtyards, the comfort of a meal hot and fragrant. To such travelers, these cities were miracles, oases of civilization in a harsh and uncertain landscape. And yet the shadows always lingered. For every light that shone from the towers and minarets, there was the reminder that no city is eternal. Dynasties would rise and fall, walls would crumble, and what had once been vibrant might one day fade into ruin. This duality, splendor and fragility, was the essence of the Silk Road cities. They embodied humanity at its most ambitious and at its most vulnerable, a reflection of the empire that nurtured them. The forgotten empire, though often unseen in the larger narratives of history, left its most enduring mark through these cities. They were its face to the world, its invitation to travelers, its promise of safety and wonder. Without them, the Silk Road would have been impossible. With them, it became one of the greatest engines of human connection the world has ever known. The cities of light and shadow remind us that civilization is never just stone and mortar, never just trade and taxation. It is the interplay of hope and fear, of dreams pursued and dangers faced. And as the caravans moved ever onward, these cities stood as their anchors, glowing with light, haunted by shadow, shaping the course of history in ways both visible and unseen. Amid the bustling streets and grand markets of the Silk Road cities, behind the walls of fortified palaces and quiet courtyards, lived the rulers of the forgotten empire. These were men and women whose names have largely faded from the pages of history, yet their influence shaped the flow of trade, the fate of travelers, and the destiny of civilizations. Unlike the conquerors of legend, their power was often exercised quietly, in whispers of diplomacy, the subtle negotiation of alliances, and the careful orchestration of wealth. To understand their world is to glimpse a delicate dance of ambition, intellect, and human frailty. The kings of this empire were not born to vast dominions stretching to every horizon, nor did they inherit the unquestioned loyalty of millions. Instead, they began with control over small, strategic cities and trade routes, slowly weaving together influence like threads in a tapestry. They were keen observers of human nature, understanding that loyalty could be earned through fairness, generosity, or fear. They built palaces that were both symbols of authority and functional centers of governance, where emissaries from distant lands arrived bearing gifts, treaties, and intelligence. Every decision mattered. One misstep could endanger caravans, inflame rival powers, or ignite internal rebellions. Queens and royal consorts, often overlooked by historians, played equally vital roles. They were patrons of art, guardians of lineage, and mediators of courtly intrigue. Some managed trade networks with the precision of a seasoned merchant, others oversaw religious institutions that reinforced the empire's cultural cohesion. In the quiet corners of palaces, they guided their husbands, negotiated alliances with neighboring rulers, and ensured that the empire's internal harmony remained intact. Their presence was subtle, yet without it, the fragile structure of governance might have collapsed. The courts themselves were a mixture of opulence and tension. Courtiers wore finely embroidered robes, their jewels catching candlelight in ways that dazzled the eye. Scholars recited poetry and philosophy in the great halls, while musicians played on lutes and flutes, filling corridors with sound that seemed to float between reality and dream. But for every moment of beauty, there were shadows of ambition and rivalry. Assassinations, betrayals, and secret alliances were not uncommon, and rulers had to navigate these dangers with caution and foresight. The court was both a center of power and a crucible of human desire, where every glance, word, and gesture carried weight. Diplomacy was as important as force. Ambassadors traveled from Persia, China, and India, carrying news of distant conflicts, proposals for trade, and subtle demands for loyalty. Kings and queens met them with ritualized courtesy, aware that the balance of their empire often depended on the careful interpretation of foreign intent. A single misread message could provoke war, a single well-placed gift could secure decades of peace. These rulers understood that control of the Silk Road required more than armies. It required perception, strategy, and the ability to foresee consequences that might stretch across continents. Yet for all their sophistication, the rulers were deeply human. They loved, grieved, celebrated, and feared, just as their subjects did. A king might mourn the loss of a favorite child even as he sent troops to defend a border. A queen might smile graciously during a diplomatic banquet while privately worrying about the loyalty of her generals. They experienced the same vulnerabilities as anyone else, but the stakes were magnified by the empire's position at the crossroads of trade and culture. Their personal triumphs and tragedies were inseparable from the fortunes of the Silk Road itself. The courts also served as incubators of culture and learning. Poetry competitions, philosophical debates, and artistic exhibitions were common, attended not only by the elite but by merchants and scholars from afar. These gatherings were more than entertainment, they were instruments of cohesion, demonstrating the empire's sophistication and encouraging loyalty among the population. Artisans, scribes, and performers were supported by royal patronage, allowing innovations in literature, music, and visual arts to flourish. In these spaces, the empire revealed a softer, more enduring power, the power to inspire, educate, and connect. Nevertheless, rulers were always acutely aware of mortality. A sudden invasion from a nomadic tribe, a rebellion in a distant province, or a poisoned gift could end a reign in an instant. To mitigate these risks, kings and queens invested in intelligence networks, spies embedded along trade routes, and fortifications designed to delay attackers. They understood that physical power alone was insufficient. Knowledge of human intent and the ability to act decisively on it were equally vital. In this way, the court was both a palace and a command center, a place where the empire's pulse could be felt and its rhythm maintained. Marriage was another instrument of power. Alliances forged through union allowed rulers to extend their influence without bloodshed. Daughters and sons were sent to distant courts not merely as family but as ambassadors of the empire, ensuring bonds of loyalty that could stabilize regions for generations. In these marriages, personal desires were often subordinated to the greater needs of the empire, a reminder that leadership on the Silk Road demanded sacrifices as profound as any battlefield victory. Despite their careful planning, the rulers of the Forgotten Empire could never fully control the unpredictable forces around them. Desert storms, sudden epidemics, and the whims of distant powers constantly tested their authority. Yet they endured, largely because their power was flexible, rooted not in brute force alone but in networks of trust, commerce, and culture. By ensuring that caravans moved safely, that markets thrived, and that cities remained connected, they preserved the lifeblood of the Silk Road and, with it, the empire itself. The Forgotten Courts also witnessed moments of extraordinary drama. A sudden betrayal by a trusted general could ignite civil war. An unexpected gift from a distant ruler might avert conflict for decades. The balance between intrigue and order was delicate, and it required rulers who could act with both patience and decisiveness. In these moments, the human dimension of history becomes vivid, reminding us that empires are not abstract constructs but living, breathing communities shaped by ambition, loyalty, and the choices of individuals. For the modern observer, these kings and queens may seem distant, their names lost to time, their deeds obscured by larger empires in China or Persia. Yet in their era, they were the stewards of civilization, guardians of knowledge, and arbiters of trade. Their decisions shaped the movement of silk, spices, and ideas. Their diplomacy ensured that caravans could traverse mountains and deserts. Their patronage enriched cultures. And their human vulnerabilities remind us that history is crafted not by anonymous forces alone but by real people navigating complex worlds. The Silk Road would never have functioned without them. For every merchant safely reaching Samarkand, every caravan that crossed the Taklamakan without incident, and every scholar who carried a manuscript from east to west, the credit belonged in part to these rulers, quiet, perceptive, and often forgotten by history. They maintained a fragile balance between light and shadow, between prosperity and peril, ensuring that the empire endured for generations. In this way, the courts of the Forgotten Empire were more than residences. They were the heart of governance, culture, and strategy. They embodied the complexity of ruling at the crossroads of the ancient world, a delicate interplay of diplomacy, intrigue, and foresight. And as caravans arrived and departed, as merchants and scholars passed through, these rulers left an indelible mark, shaping a world that would one day stretch across continents and centuries. Their legacy is subtle but profound. Without their leadership, the Silk Road might have remained a dangerous series of unconnected paths. With it, trade, culture, and ideas flowed safely across mountains, deserts, and rivers, creating a network of human connection whose echoes can still be felt today. These were the kings, queens, and forgotten courts, the stewards of civilization, the invisible architects of one of history's most extraordinary empires. The roads of the Silk Road were not paved in safety. They stretched across deserts that burned beneath the sun and froze beneath the stars, over mountains where avalanches could bury a caravan in minutes, and through plains where raiders struck like ghosts in the night. To navigate these dangers, the Forgotten Empire relied on a class of men and women whose presence was as crucial as the trade itself, the warriors of the crossroads. They were not only soldiers but protectors, guides, and enforcers, individuals who understood the land, the people, and the delicate balance of power that allowed the Silk Road to function. These warriors were drawn from diverse backgrounds. Some were seasoned nomads of the steppes, riders who could traverse hundreds of miles in a single day and knew the patterns of the wind and the stars as well as they knew their horses. Others were city-born, trained in the disciplined arts of combat and strategy, loyal to the empire and skilled in the protection of merchants and caravans. They were archers and swordsmen, scouts and strategists, their roles overlapping, their unity forged in the crucible of necessity. Each understood that failure could mean death not only for themselves but for the traders, scholars, and goods whose survival depended on their vigilance. The warrior's presence was both visible and subtle. In cities like Samarkand and Bukhara, guards patrolled the gates and markets, their eyes sharp for signs of trouble, their presence reassuring to merchants from distant lands. Along the roads, mounted patrols scouted ahead of caravans, detecting ambushes, bandits, and natural hazards before the travelers encountered them. They built watchtowers at key points, mountain passes, desert edges, river crossings, where fires could signal danger to distant outposts. These were not mere soldiers, they were the empire's nervous system, constantly sensing, reacting, and protecting. Their weapons were as varied as their skills. Bows and arrows, curved to allow rapid firing on horseback, were prized among the nomads. Swords, spears, and maces were carried by city-trained warriors, forged with care to endure long campaigns. Shields embossed with emblems of the empire were not just defensive tools but symbols of authority, signaling to all who approached that this territory was watched and controlled. Armor ranged from light leather, allowing speed and mobility, to heavier chain or plated suits for those guarding key caravans. Each warrior carried not only weapons but knowledge of the land, routes, water sources, and hiding places, a mental map as crucial as any sword or spear. Protecting trade was not the only duty of these warriors. They enforced the laws of the empire, ensuring that caravans paid their dues and merchants adhered to contracts. They mediated disputes between travelers, sometimes preventing minor disagreements from escalating into deadly confrontations. In border regions, they negotiated with nomadic tribes, using diplomacy when possible, force when necessary. Their authority was respected because it was earned, rooted in skill, fairness, and the ability to navigate a world where danger lurked behind every dune and over every ridge. The life of a warrior on the Silk Road was both harsh and transient. Long journeys across deserts meant thirst, hunger, and fatigue. Cold nights in the mountains tested endurance, while sudden storms and sandstorms could strike with little warning. Yet these hardships were also a form of training, shaping individuals who could think quickly, adapt, and survive in extreme conditions. A single mistake, misjudging the depth of a river, underestimating the speed of an ambushing raider, could end a life or doom a caravan. Through this constant pressure, the warriors developed a resilience that became the backbone of the empire's security. Warfare, when it came, was both swift and brutal. Raiders on horseback could appear almost invisibly, striking caravans with precision and disappearing before reinforcements arrived. The warriors of the crossroads learned to anticipate such attacks, using scouts, signals, and strategic positioning to protect those under their care. They became experts in terrain, turning mountains, valleys, and river crossings into natural defenses. They understood the psychology of both merchants and enemies, using intimidation and surprise to prevent conflict whenever possible. Victory was often measured not in slaughter but in survival, the safe arrival of goods and people at their destinations. Yet these warriors were not merely practical. There was a sense of honor and pride in their duty. Protecting the Silk Road was protecting civilization itself. Each caravan saved, each city defended, and each ambush prevented reinforced the continuity of culture, trade, and learning. In their service, they became guardians not just of wealth but of knowledge, art, and human connection. A soldier who ensured the safe delivery of a Buddhist manuscript from India to Samarkand was as vital to history as any king or merchant. Their work was silent, often unnoticed, but indispensable. The warriors also maintained a delicate balance between protection and intimidation. In some regions, their presence deterred bandits before a blade was drawn. In others, the display of armed strength reminded merchants and travelers that the empire's authority extended even into the most remote desert or mountain pass. This balance required discipline, judgment, and restraint, qualities that separated skilled warriors from mere brutes. They were teachers of order, not just instruments of violence. Over time, these warriors became intertwined with the culture of the empire. Songs were sung about their exploits, tales of courage and cleverness passed down through generations. Their legends inspired loyalty among the young, who aspired to the same dedication and skill. Caravans moving along the Silk Road would recount stories of warriors who had saved lives against overwhelming odds, blending reality with myth in ways that reinforced both the empire's authority and its enduring mystery. The crossroads they protected were not static. The routes of the Silk Road shifted with climate, politics, and economic demand. Warriors had to adapt constantly, scouting new paths, negotiating passage with different tribes, and establishing temporary posts to ensure continuity. This required intelligence and flexibility, qualities that made them more than soldiers. They were problem solvers, tacticians, and innovators, capable of anticipating changes in terrain, weather, and human behavior. Even as the empire's cities rose in splendor, it was the warriors who ensured that caravans could reach them safely. Without their vigilance, wealth would have been pillaged, scholars stranded, and ideas lost. They were the unseen hands that guided history, making it possible for merchants to traverse thousands of miles, for cultures to intermingle, and for the Silk Road to function as a lifeline of the ancient world. Their legacy, like that of the forgotten empire itself, is largely invisible today. Ruins of watchtowers and caravanserais hint at their presence, but the true impact of their work is woven into the flow of trade and culture that shaped civilizations. The Silk Road was not merely a road of commerce, it was a corridor of survival, learning, and human ambition, held together by those who understood the land, its dangers, and the fragility of what they protected. The warriors of the crossroads remind us that history is sustained as much by those who guard, guide, and endure as by those who rule or trade. They were the quiet custodians of connection, the living bridges between cultures, and the invisible protectors of a world in motion. Through deserts and mountains, under blistering sun and freezing nights, they held the Silk Road together, ensuring that light could travel alongside shadow, and that the forgotten empire could thrive at the heart of one of history's most extraordinary networks. Along the winding paths of the Silk Road, it was the merchants who transformed raw ambition into tangible reality. They were the lifeblood of the forgotten empire, the ones who carried silk, spices, precious metals, and manuscripts across thousands of miles of treacherous terrain. But they were more than carriers of goods, they were the orchestrators of commerce, the diplomats of distant lands, and the keepers of stories, knowledge, and culture. Their work was a daily miracle, navigating deserts, mountains, and political rivalries, while turning mere survival into the extraordinary flow of wealth, ideas, and human connection. Merchants were born of necessity and opportunity. In small cities and oases, they learned early that survival demanded flexibility, negotiation, and foresight. They studied languages, memorized distant markets, and developed an uncanny ability to read people. One wrong word, one poorly timed negotiation, could cost a fortune or a life. Yet those who mastered these skills were rewarded not only with wealth but with influence. A successful merchant could shape local economies, influence rulers, and even affect the outcome of conflicts. In the forgotten empire, commerce was power, and merchants were its quiet wielders. The wealth they managed was staggering. Silk from China, spun into threads so fine they seemed to float in the air, traveled across deserts to dress the nobility of Rome and Byzantium. Spices from India, cinnamon, cardamom, saffron, infused the meals and medicine of distant courts. Gems, jade, and rare metals journeyed thousands of miles, each item not just valuable but imbued with stories, traditions, and the labor of countless hands. The merchants moved all this with meticulous care, calculating risks and timing journeys to coincide with seasonal advantages, safe passage, and political stability. They were logisticians in a world without maps as we know them, and their networks became the backbone of the empire's influence. Money itself became a language along the Silk Road. Coins from Persia, China, and Rome circulated alongside barter agreements, promissory notes, and credit arrangements that bound traders across continents. Merchants developed intricate systems of accounting and trust, knowing that a miscalculation could ruin not just themselves but an entire caravan. Letters of credit, early forms of banking, allowed transactions to occur over distances that would take months to traverse on horseback. These innovations were as revolutionary as the goods they carried, laying the foundations for modern commerce while ensuring that trade along the Silk Road remained efficient and relatively secure. The life of a merchant was as perilous as it was profitable. Crossing deserts meant facing blistering heat by day, freezing temperatures by night, and the constant threat of sandstorms that could swallow entire caravans. Mountains were treacherous, avalanches, rockslides, and sudden snowstorms were common. Political instability, an unexpected change in local rulers, a sudden border closure, or the rise of a hostile nomadic tribe could upend carefully laid plans. Bandits lurked in the shadows, and disease traveled invisibly, striking without warning. And yet, merchants continued, driven by ambition, necessity, and the potential for extraordinary reward. Trade was not only economic but also cultural. Merchants were the primary carriers of ideas, languages, and technologies. A merchant from Persia might introduce new weaving techniques to Central Asia, while a traveler from India could spread medical knowledge and religious teachings. Manuscripts, maps, and scientific instruments moved alongside silks and spices, allowing civilizations separated by thousands of miles to influence one another. In this way, merchants became the silent architects of cultural diffusion, connecting societies that would otherwise remain isolated. Miracles happened along these routes every day, though they often went unrecorded. A caravan might survive a sandstorm that buried its path, only to find a hidden oasis with water and shelter. A trade negotiation that seemed destined for failure could turn in a single gesture of goodwill, securing contracts that would enrich entire cities. Merchants often relied on intuition, observation, and sheer human ingenuity to navigate challenges that would confound ordinary travelers. Every successful journey was, in its own way, a miracle of coordination, courage, and careful planning. Merchants also understood the importance of reputation. Trust was the currency that exceeded gold, silver, or silk. A merchant known for honesty and reliability could travel from China to the Mediterranean with little fear, while one who cheated even once risked losing access to entire networks. They developed complex social codes, understanding that alliances with local rulers, tribes, and fellow traders were essential to survival. Relationships mattered as much as wealth, and the ability to maintain them over vast distances and through generations became a defining skill of the forgotten empire's trade system. Caravans were microcosms of human society. They included merchants, guards, translators, cooks, and animal handlers, each playing a critical role. The movement of goods required careful coordination. Camels and horses had to be fed and rested, routes calculated, water sources secured. Merchants kept meticulous records, noting supplies, debts, and trade agreements. In a single caravan, the interconnectedness of economics, geography, and human endurance was vividly on display. It was a world in miniature, where success depended on teamwork, foresight, and the ability to adapt to unforeseen circumstances. The interaction between merchants and local rulers was particularly fascinating. Kings and queens relied on these traders to fill their coffers with revenue, to bring luxury goods that enhanced prestige, and to transmit intelligence from distant lands. In turn, merchants relied on protection, safe passage, and stable markets. This mutual dependence created a subtle power dynamic. The merchant could wield influence over rulers by controlling the flow of wealth, while the ruler could regulate commerce to ensure order and prosperity. These interactions, often conducted with a combination of diplomacy and negotiation, were essential to maintaining the fragile balance that kept the Silk Road alive. Miracles were also found in human resilience and ingenuity. When caravans were stranded in snowbound passes or lost in the desert, resourcefulness often determined survival. A merchant might barter for shelter with a nomadic tribe, repair a broken wheel with local materials, or use ancient navigation techniques to find a lost water source. These stories, passed down along the Silk Road, became legends of courage, determination, and the quiet triumph of human will. In essence, merchants transformed the Silk Road into more than a trade network. They made it a living conduit of civilization. Every item transported carried wealth, culture, and stories. Every negotiation secured alliances or reinforced trust. Every successful journey was a small miracle, a triumph over the physical and human challenges of one of history's most demanding environments. Through their work, the Forgotten Empire solidified its influence, ensuring that trade, ideas, and culture flowed uninterrupted across continents. The Silk Road's merchants remind us that history is not made solely by kings or armies but also by those who connect, endure, and innovate. Their courage, intelligence, and foresight ensured that the empire at the heart of the Silk Road could thrive, creating a world in which distant civilizations became intimately linked. In their hands, money and goods became instruments of culture, diplomacy, and survival, a testament to the extraordinary power of human ingenuity in the face of daunting odds. As the Silk Road stretched across deserts and mountains, the journey between great cities was punctuated by caravan stops, temporary havens where merchants, travelers, and soldiers alike found rest, trade, and companionship. These caravan cities were more than logistical necessities, they were vibrant intersections of culture, commerce, and human curiosity. Here, the threads of the empire's vast network converged, creating spaces where languages, religions, and artistic traditions blended seamlessly. In these cities, one could witness the full spectrum of human experience, the ordinary and the extraordinary, the fleeting and the enduring, woven together into the rich tapestry of the Silk Road. Caravan cities often sprang up at strategic locations, near oases, at river crossings, or at the foot of mountain passes. Their existence depended on water, shelter, and accessibility, and their architecture reflected the dual needs of utility and beauty. Simple mud brick walls offered protection against raiders, while shaded courtyards, wells, and stables ensured that people and animals could endure the harsh climate. Streets were narrow, winding, and bustling, lined with stalls selling silks, spices, dried fruits, and metals from distant lands. In these marketplaces, the hum of negotiation and storytelling blended into a unique rhythm, a melody of survival, hope, and ambition. These cities were melting pots of cultural exchange. Merchants from China, Persia, India, and the Mediterranean mingled, sharing languages, customs, and culinary practices. In a single day, a traveler might hear Sanskrit prayers mingled with Persian poetry, taste bread baked in a Chinese oven alongside Indian spices, and witness artisans weaving designs inspired by Greek motifs. Caravan cities were laboratories of cultural synthesis, where traditions collided and blended, creating new forms of art, religion, and social practice. The Forgotten Empire encouraged this mingling, recognizing that a thriving network depended not just on commerce but also on the exchange of ideas. Religious diversity was particularly striking. Buddhist monks established temples and meditation halls, offering travelers spiritual refuge and guidance. Zoroastrian fire temples glimmered in the sunlight, while Christian Nestorian communities constructed small chapels along the routes. Later, Islamic influence would grow, introducing mosques and schools that further enriched the spiritual landscape. In caravan cities, different faiths often coexisted peacefully, facilitated by the empire's commitment to tolerance and the practical need to maintain harmony among diverse populations. This coexistence fostered dialogue, understanding, and the cross-pollination of beliefs that would leave a lasting mark on human history. Art and craftsmanship flourished in caravan cities. Local artisans absorbed foreign techniques, producing objects that reflected multiple influences. Persian floral patterns might appear on Chinese silk, Indian metalwork might incorporate designs from Central Asia. Music and dance traveled alongside merchants, introducing rhythms and instruments from distant lands. Storytellers recounted tales of faraway kingdoms, blending myth and history into narratives that captivated listeners. These cities became incubators of creativity, where innovation thrived because ideas moved freely, carried by the countless people who passed through each season. Education and knowledge were equally vital. Caravan cities often hosted small schools, libraries, or scholarly gatherings where mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy were taught and debated. Manuscripts traveled as eagerly as spices and silk, ensuring that knowledge spread across continents. Scholars acted as intermediaries, translating texts and sharing discoveries that would later influence civilizations far removed from their origins. The roads that connected these cities were conduits not only of wealth but also of enlightenment, with each journey contributing to a slowly expanding web of human understanding. The social fabric of caravan cities was intricate and layered. Wealthy merchants mingled with local tradespeople, travelers with guides, and guards with diplomats. Festivals, market days, and religious ceremonies offered structured opportunities for interaction, while informal gatherings in tea houses and inns allowed for personal exchanges. Children learned multiple languages, absorbed stories from afar, and observed a variety of customs. These cities were microcosms of the larger empire, reflecting its diversity, resilience, and complexity. Security was a constant concern. While the forgotten empire's warriors protected main routes, caravan cities needed their own defenses. Walls and gates were carefully maintained, patrols moved day and night, and watchtowers overlooked the surrounding plains. Merchants and travelers often paid fees or contributed labor to maintain these defenses, recognizing that their survival depended on collective vigilance. Bandits and rogue tribes were deterred not only by physical fortifications but also by the city's reputation for vigilance and organization. In this way, caravan cities functioned as safe havens, allowing the Silk Road to remain a reliable network despite the constant threats posed by geography and human ambition. Amid the bustling markets, caravan stops, and fortress-like cities of the Silk Road, there existed a quieter, more profound heartbeat: the temples, schools, and libraries where knowledge was cultivated, preserved, and shared. These centers were sanctuaries of thought, where the hum of commerce faded into the gentle rustle of parchment, the soft murmur of prayers, and the rhythmic scratching of scribes copying texts. In a world defined by movement, trade, and peril, these spaces were islands of stillness, offering travelers, merchants, and locals alike a place to contemplate, learn, and connect with ideas that spanned continents and centuries. Buddhist monasteries were among the most prominent institutions along the Silk Road. Carved into mountainsides or constructed in oasis cities, they offered not only spiritual guidance but also education. Monks meticulously copied sutras, preserving religious texts and philosophical treatises that would travel thousands of miles to lands far beyond their origin. Meditation halls and lecture rooms became classrooms, where the principles of ethics, logic, and metaphysics were taught alongside religious ritual. For many travelers, the monasteries were havens of peace, where weary souls could rest both body and mind while absorbing wisdom that transcended borders. Zoroastrian fire temples were similarly influential, providing continuity and guidance to communities that stretched from Persia to Central Asia. In these sacred spaces, priests maintained ritual fires that symbolized purity and cosmic order, and they instructed students in religious law, astronomy, and moral philosophy. The flames flickering in the dim halls were more than symbols. They represented the persistence of knowledge and culture in a world where empires rose and fell with astonishing speed. Scholars and travelers alike respected these spaces for the discipline and insight they embodied, often pausing to exchange ideas or seek counsel before resuming their arduous journeys. Nestorian Christian communities also flourished along the Silk Road, constructing chapels, schools, and translation centers. These institutions were often small, yet their impact was immense. Nestorian scholars translated Greek, Persian, and Syriac texts into local languages, preserving knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. Their libraries became quiet repositories of science, medicine, philosophy, and theology. Traveling merchants or diplomats could access this wisdom, learning practical techniques for navigation, agriculture, and medicine, as well as absorbing moral and spiritual guidance. The exchange of knowledge across religious and cultural boundaries became a defining feature of these centers, reflecting the Silk Road's broader ethos of connectivity. Islamic influence would later reshape many of these intellectual spaces, introducing mosques, madrasas, and libraries where scholars studied law, astronomy, mathematics, and literature. The madrasas, with their courtyards and quiet study halls, became hubs of inquiry, where ideas from India, Persia, and China mingled and evolved. Students copied manuscripts with painstaking care, ensuring that knowledge endured across generations. Scholars debated quietly but passionately, their discussions forming networks of understanding that linked distant regions. The empire recognized that these intellectual investments strengthened the Silk Road not only materially but culturally, fostering loyalty and cohesion among diverse populations. The libraries along the Silk Road were particularly remarkable. They housed texts on subjects as varied as medicine, mathematics, astronomy, poetry, and history. Some manuscripts contained practical knowledge for merchants and travelers, instructions on measuring distances, calculating exchange rates, or predicting seasonal changes. Others delved into abstract thought, exploring metaphysics, cosmology, or ethics. The movement of these texts between cities allowed innovations to spread rapidly, ensuring that discoveries in one region could influence developments far away. Knowledge became as portable and valuable as silk or spices, and merchants and scholars alike became its carriers. Education was deeply intertwined with daily life. Children learned multiple languages, including Chinese, Persian, Sanskrit, and local dialects, as part of both formal schooling and practical necessity. They observed religious rituals, memorized texts, and practiced arithmetic essential for commerce. Travelers could witness a remarkable blending of cultures, where students learned Buddhist chants alongside Persian poetry or Islamic law. In these ways, the empire cultivated not only scholars but citizens capable of navigating the complexities of a vast, interconnected world. Temples and schools also served as hubs of diplomacy and cultural exchange. A visiting merchant or diplomat might meet a scholar who spoke of distant lands, offering insights into political climates, customs, or trade opportunities. Religious leaders mediated disputes, advised rulers, or provided guidance to travelers. The combination of intellectual rigor and spiritual authority gave these centers an influence far beyond their walls, shaping decisions, alliances, and social norms across the Silk Road. Beyond the fortified walls of caravan cities, across endless deserts, and over the rolling grasslands, the Silk Road was shaped by another force, the nomads. These were not idle wanderers, but skilled navigators of the steppe, desert, and mountain, whose lives intertwined with the rhythm of nature and the needs of the empire. They were guardians, guides, and occasional raiders, whose knowledge of terrain, climate, and survival made them indispensable to the trade network. To understand the forgotten empire, one must understand the nomads, the silent pulse that carried the Silk Road forward, beating steadily beneath the noise of markets, caravans, and city life. Nomadic tribes followed ancient patterns, moving with the seasons in harmony with grass, water, and weather. Their herds of horses, camels, and sheep dictated the rhythm of daily life, and their survival depended on intimate knowledge of the environment. In this vast, often unforgiving landscape, they became unparalleled navigators. They knew which riverbeds remained reliable in summer, which mountain passes were safest during snowstorms, and where hidden oases could sustain life for days. Merchants traveling along the Silk Road relied on this knowledge, hiring guides who could lead them safely through regions where maps offered little certainty. Without these nomads, entire stretches of the trade network would have been impassable or deadly. Nomads were more than guides, they were intermediaries. They negotiated access to pastures, water, and trade routes, balancing relationships with other tribes and with the empire itself. In some cases, they served as scouts, warning of impending danger or signaling the approach of armies. Their allegiance could shift, and the empire maintained careful diplomacy to ensure cooperation. A successful relationship with a nomadic tribe could mean safe passage for caravans for decades, while neglect or insult could provoke raids that disrupted trade, destabilized cities, and imperiled travelers. The empire understood that the pulse of the steppe was fragile and required both respect and strategy. The nomad skills extended to combat, yet unlike conventional armies, they fought with mobility and precision. Horse archery, lightning raids, and intimate knowledge of terrain gave them advantages that settled armies often could not match. These abilities were employed both in defense of their territories and in service to the empire. On occasions when trade routes were threatened by bandits or rival powers, nomads acted as the first line of defense, leveraging their speed and agility to intercept raiders before they could harm caravans. They were both protector and enforcer, their effectiveness rooted in generations of environmental and tactical mastery. Daily life for nomads was a study in resilience and adaptation. Tents made from felt or animal hides provided shelter from scorching days and freezing nights. Meals were simple yet nutritious, often consisting of dried meat, milk, and grains. Water sources dictated the pace of travel, and every journey required careful planning. Despite this simplicity, nomads maintained rich oral traditions, telling stories of ancestors, heroes, and distant lands. These tales were not mere entertainment, they were repositories of history, geography, and wisdom, teaching younger generations the skills, ethics, and strategies necessary to survive in a harsh and unpredictable world. Their role in trade was multifaceted. Some nomads became traders themselves, moving goods across regions too dangerous or remote for larger caravans. Others facilitated the flow of information, serving as messengers between cities, rulers, and merchants. Their mobility and knowledge allowed the empire to maintain connections that might otherwise have faltered. Through these activities, nomads ensured that wealth, ideas, and culture continued to move, often unseen, beneath the surface of history, quietly binding civilizations together across vast distances. Nomads also contributed to cultural exchange. As they guided caravans, they introduced languages, stories, and customs to merchants and travelers. Likewise, they absorbed influences from cities and distant lands, incorporating foreign technologies, textiles, and ideas into their own culture. The result was a dynamic, adaptive society that acted as a bridge between settled civilizations and the wild expanses beyond. Their adaptability and openness were crucial to the functioning of the Silk Road, which depended on constant negotiation and mutual understanding between diverse peoples. Seasonal rhythms dictated much of the Silk Road's movement. Caravans and nomads alike timed their journeys to coincide with spring rains or winter thaws, navigating rivers, mountain passes, and deserts according to a calendar embedded in the landscape itself. The nomads' intimate knowledge of this cycle ensured safety and efficiency, preventing loss of life, goods, and time. Without their guidance, traders would have been vulnerable to floods, snowstorms, or sandstorms, natural forces that could easily end a journey prematurely or permanently. The empire valued this knowledge, often formalizing relationships with nomadic leaders through alliances, trade agreements, or even marriages. Tribes that cooperated gained protection, access to lucrative markets, and prestige, while the empire secured the continuity of trade and the safety of its citizens. In this delicate balance, the pulse of the steppe was both respected and integrated into the broader strategy of governance. Diplomacy, negotiation, and cultural sensitivity were as important as martial skill, demonstrating that the Silk Road's success relied equally on intellect and instinct. Nomads were also carriers of intangible wealth, news, ideas, and cultural practices. They conveyed intelligence about political changes, conflicts, or natural events that could affect trade. They transmitted stories, songs, and religious beliefs, subtly weaving the threads of culture across continents. Each encounter between a caravan and a nomadic tribe became a microcosm of exchange, where goods, knowledge, and human experience flowed together. In this way, nomads acted as both the bloodstream and nervous system of the Silk Road, enabling commerce, communication, and cultural continuity. Even as empires rose and fell, the nomads endured. Their survival depended on adaptability, knowledge, and skill rather than fixed cities or monumental architecture. They maintained the rhythms of the land, ensuring that the Silk Road remained alive, functional, and vibrant. Without them, merchants would have struggled to traverse vast stretches of hostile terrain, cities would have seen trade falter, and the flow of ideas and culture would have slowed dramatically. The pulse of the steppe was invisible to many, yet it was essential to the heartbeat of the empire itself. The legacy of nomads endures in the historical memory of the Silk Road. Their contribution was not measured merely in victories or conquests but in the quiet facilitation of human connection across deserts, mountains, and plains. They remind us that the survival of civilizations often depends on those who navigate uncertainty with skill, intuition, and courage. Through their mobility, knowledge, and resilience, they made possible the remarkable achievements of the forgotten empire, sustaining trade, culture, and communication in ways both tangible and profound. In essence, the nomads were the lifeblood of the Silk Road's vast network. They were guides, protectors, intermediaries, and conveyors of culture, embodying the rhythm of the steppe and the pulse of a civilization that connected East and West. Through their work, the empire maintained continuity, and the Silk Road thrived as a corridor not only of commerce but of human experience, knowledge, and ingenuity. Without them, the grand tapestry of trade, culture, and learning that defined the forgotten empire could never have been woven. The pulse of the Silk Road was driven not only by human effort but by the irresistible allure of goods that promised wealth, power, and prestige. Among the most coveted commodities were silk and spices, treasures that defined empires and shaped global economies. Silk, with its ethereal texture and shimmering colors, was more than fabric. It was a symbol of status, artistry, and technological mastery. Spices, exotic and rare, transformed cuisine, medicine, and ritual, linking distant lands through taste, aroma, and cultural significance. Together, these goods underpinned the forgotten empire's economic power, creating networks of wealth, influence, and interdependence that spanned continents. Silk's journey began in the mulberry groves and workshops of China, where silkworms spun threads of astonishing fineness. These threads were meticulously processed, dyed, and woven into fabrics that ranged from the simplest garments to the most elaborate ceremonial robes. The techniques were jealously guarded, a trade secret that gave China, and by extension the Silk Road, a unique advantage. Yet the forgotten empire understood that mastery lay not only in production but in distribution, and it built the infrastructure, security, and knowledge networks required to move silk thousands of miles across deserts, mountains, and rivers. Every bolt of silk carried stories, culture, and value far beyond its material worth. Spices were equally transformative. Cinnamon, cardamom, saffron, cloves, and nutmeg journeyed from India, Southeast Asia, and the islands beyond, reaching markets where they commanded enormous prices. They were not merely culinary enhancements, they were medicine, preservative, and ritual ingredient, indispensable to societies across the ancient world. Spices symbolized the wealth and sophistication of empires, and controlling their flow conferred immense economic and political leverage. The Silk Road functioned as a delicate artery through which these treasures moved, requiring negotiation, diplomacy, and logistical ingenuity at every stage. Merchants orchestrated this movement with remarkable skill. They calculated risks, coordinated caravans, and balanced supply and demand across regions separated by thousands of miles. Payment systems were sophisticated, using coins, letters of credit, and barter to ensure that value was recognized and preserved. Seasonal knowledge, awareness of bandit activity, and relationships with nomadic guides ensured that goods arrived safely. The economic ecosystem of the Silk Road was thus a marvel of coordination, where trust, skill, and strategy were as critical as the value of the commodities themselves. The empire's economy depended on the steady circulation of wealth and goods. Taxes and tariffs from trade provided revenue for city construction, military campaigns, and public works. Guilds and merchant associations regulated quality, ensured fair practices, and coordinated the movement of caravans. Markets flourished, bringing prosperity not only to rulers and traders but to artisans, laborers, and local populations. The flow of silk and spices became both a literal and symbolic lifeblood of the empire, enabling social cohesion and sustaining cultural vibrancy across its vast territories. The impact of these commodities extended beyond wealth. Silk, for example, was integral to diplomacy, often given as tribute to foreign rulers to secure alliances or demonstrate prestige. Spices played similar roles, gifted to impress dignitaries or mark special occasions. Through these goods, the empire projected influence, reinforcing political authority while facilitating cultural exchange. Economic activity became intertwined with diplomacy and social hierarchy, making trade a multidimensional force that shaped both private and public life. Risk was inseparable from reward. Caravans transporting valuable goods faced natural hazards, such as desert storms, mountain landslides, or frozen river crossings. Human threats were equally daunting. Bandits, rival traders, and political instability could turn a profitable journey into catastrophe. To mitigate these dangers, merchants relied on meticulous planning, armed guards, nomadic guides, and the empire's protective structures. Every successful delivery was thus a triumph of foresight, coordination, and human resilience, a delicate dance in which fortunes and lives hung in the balance. Trade fostered innovation. Weaving techniques improved as silks encountered new tastes and demands. Spices were blended into new recipes, preserved in innovative ways, or repurposed for medicinal use. Merchants developed standardized weights and measures, calendars for trade, and early accounting systems that allowed for complex transactions over vast distances. These innovations enhanced efficiency, reinforced trust, and amplified the empire's economic strength, demonstrating that the Silk Road was a laboratory for practical and intellectual ingenuity. Markets became stages for cultural display. Merchants would showcase exotic goods with care, arranging silks, spices, and other treasures in visually compelling ways to attract buyers. Aromas of rare spices mingled with the visual spectacle of patterned textiles, gemstones, and metals. Haggling and negotiation were performed with ritualized precision, blending practicality with performance. These markets were microcosms of the empire itself, diverse, dynamic, and infused with energy, where wealth, culture, and human ingenuity intersected daily. The empire also encouraged local production to complement trade. Silk workshops, spice farms, and artisan communities grew around caravan cities, producing goods tailored to demand from across the Silk Road. This localized production ensured supply, generated employment, and allowed for experimentation with techniques and designs. Artisans became both cultural ambassadors and economic agents, their work shaping the tastes, aesthetics, and practical needs of distant societies. The fusion of local craft with international demand reinforced the interconnectedness that defined the Silk Road's prosperity. The scale of this economic network was staggering. Goods moved not only east to west but in all directions, creating a complex web of trade that linked remote regions to the centers of power. Merchants coordinated shipments, balanced inventories, and maintained records that spanned continents. The economy was as much about intelligence, strategy, and human skill as it was about wealth, demonstrating the empire's sophisticated understanding of commerce. Control of trade routes, security, and currency ensured that the empire maintained dominance while fostering an environment in which merchants, artisans, and local populations could thrive. Yet perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the Silk Road's economics was its role in shaping civilization itself. Silk and spices were more than commodities, they were catalysts for connection. They facilitated cultural exchange, inspired artistic creation, influenced political relationships, and spread knowledge and religion. The economic flow along the Silk Road became a vehicle for human interaction on a scale unparalleled in the ancient world. Without these tangible treasures, the intangible networks of influence, learning, and culture might never have flourished so broadly. The forgotten empire's mastery of silk, spices, and commerce demonstrates the inseparable link between economics and civilization. It shows how wealth, carefully managed and strategically deployed, can shape societies, create stability, and inspire creativity. Through the movement of goods, the empire fostered an interconnected world in which distant cultures influenced one another, ideas traveled as freely as commodities, and human ingenuity was rewarded with both material and cultural abundance. In the final analysis, the flow of silk and spices was a testament to the empire's vision, resilience, and adaptability. These commodities were not mere luxuries, they were the engine of civilization, sustaining trade, diplomacy, and culture across deserts, mountains, and plains. The Silk Road became a corridor of human endeavor, where the tangible and intangible intertwined, shaping the destiny of countless peoples and leaving a legacy that continues to fascinate and inspire. The story of the forgotten empire is a tale of triumph and fragility, of brilliance tempered by vulnerability, and of an empire whose very success sowed the seeds of its eventual decline. From humble beginnings along river valleys and fertile plains, it rose to dominate the Silk Road, establishing a network of cities, trade routes, and cultural connections unparalleled in the ancient world. Its ascent was a symphony of vision, diplomacy, commerce, and intellect, a careful weaving of human ambition with natural opportunity. Yet, as with all great civilizations, the empire's apex was precarious, balanced delicately between internal cohesion and external pressures, prosperity and overextension, order and entropy. The rise of the empire was marked by bold leadership, strategic innovation, and a profound understanding of geography. Its rulers recognized that control of trade routes, rather than merely conquest of land, was the key to enduring influence. They invested in infrastructure, roads, bridges, fortifications, and caravanserais that ensured the movement of goods, people, and ideas. Diplomacy was carefully calibrated, alliances formed with nomadic tribes and neighboring kingdoms, and treaties maintained the fragile peace necessary for commerce to flourish. Every decision was made with foresight, blending immediate utility with long-term vision. The empire did not merely grow, it orchestrated its growth, transforming opportunity into power with remarkable skill. At the apex, the empire's cities gleamed as beacons of culture and wealth. Palaces rose alongside bustling marketplaces, libraries, and temples, each reflecting the intellectual and spiritual vitality of the age. Silk, spices, metals, and exotic goods flowed in and out of these urban centers, bringing wealth that allowed for grand architecture, patronage of the arts, and the support of scholars, artisans, and religious leaders. The economy was sophisticated, with taxation, guilds, and trade regulations creating a stable environment for prosperity. Social hierarchies and governance structures were refined, ensuring that resources were mobilized effectively and that civic life could flourish even amidst the vast diversity of cultures and peoples under the empire's influence. Cultural achievement mirrored economic and political power. Caravan cities and capital centers became laboratories of innovation. Religious diversity flourished, with Buddhism, Zoroastrianism, Christianity, and later Islam coexisting in complex but generally harmonious patterns. Artisans integrated motifs from multiple cultures, creating textiles, ceramics, and architecture that reflected a cosmopolitan worldview. Scholars translated and preserved manuscripts, while astronomers, physicians, and mathematicians advanced knowledge in ways that would resonate far beyond the empire's borders. Music, poetry, and storytelling intertwined, animating both public life and private contemplation. At its height, the empire was not merely a political or economic entity, it was a living, breathing civilization, a network of people, ideas, and goods that reached from desert sands to snow-capped peaks. Yet the very factors that enabled this apex also introduced fragility. The empire's vast reach required constant coordination, communication, and trust. Trade networks depended on the reliability of nomads, merchants, and distant city administrators. Seasonal variations, natural disasters, or shifts in political alliances could disrupt the flow of goods and information. Maintaining stability across vast and often hostile territories demanded extraordinary effort, and the empire's success made it a target for both external adversaries and internal factions. Prosperity bred ambition, and ambition occasionally undermined cohesion. Internal pressures began subtly. Regional governors and city leaders, empowered by wealth and autonomy, sometimes acted independently of central authority, making decisions that benefited local interests but eroded imperial unity. Competition among merchants, guilds, and political elites occasionally led to tension and corruption, weakening the networks that had previously functioned with remarkable efficiency. Social inequalities, though mitigated by trade and cultural cohesion, generated unrest in certain areas. The delicate balance between central control and local autonomy required constant vigilance, and the empire's administrators faced the challenge of governing a vast, diverse, and dynamic civilization with limited communication technologies. External threats compounded these internal strains. Nomadic tribes, who had once been allies and guides, sometimes turned to raids or demanded higher tributes, testing the empire's capacity for diplomacy and defense. Neighboring kingdoms grew envious of the empire's wealth and influence, launching attacks that, while often repelled, drained resources and diverted attention from governance and trade. Shifts in trade patterns, such as the emergence of maritime routes, reduced reliance on traditional Silk Road paths, threatening the economic foundations upon which the empire's power rested. These cumulative pressures created an environment in which decline, though gradual, became increasingly inevitable. Despite these challenges, the empire's resilience was remarkable. Administrators, merchants, and scholars adapted to changing conditions, finding new routes, negotiating fresh alliances, and preserving knowledge even as political authority faltered. Caravan cities continued to hum with activity, temples and schools nurtured learning, and the cultural synthesis that defined the Silk Road endured. Decline was not a sudden collapse but a slow unraveling of complexity, a contraction of influence rather than an abrupt disappearance. This gradual process preserved much of the empire's legacy, allowing its contributions to trade, culture, and knowledge to endure long after political control waned. The fragility of human ambition is a recurring theme in history, and the forgotten empire exemplifies this truth. Its achievements were extraordinary, yet they rested on delicate balances between wealth and security, expansion and administration, cultural diversity and cohesion. The threads that wove together its vast territories were strong, yet tension, miscalculation, and environmental pressures could, and did, fray them over time. Observers at the time may have witnessed the early signs of decline without fully grasping the scale of its implications, while later historians marvel at how an empire so sophisticated could gradually disappear from memory. Still, even in decline, the empire's influence persisted. Trade routes continued to function, albeit under new political authorities. Knowledge preserved in temples, libraries, and monasteries survived the upheaval of conquest and shifting borders. Cultural practices, artistic motifs, and technological innovations diffused further, enriching neighboring civilizations. The Silk Road remained alive, a testament to the enduring value of infrastructure, human ingenuity, and intercultural connectivity established by the forgotten empire. Its decline serves as both a cautionary tale and a source of inspiration, a reminder that even in fragility, human achievement can leave a lasting imprint on the world. The empire's story illuminates the interplay between ambition and impermanence. Its rise demonstrates the extraordinary potential of coordinated vision, trade, and cultural openness. Its apex showcases the heights to which civilization can ascend when intellect, spirituality, commerce, and governance align. And its decline reminds us that no matter how brilliant, empires are subject to forces beyond immediate control: geography, human ambition, environmental change, and the passage of time. Within this cycle lies a profound lesson: greatness is both achievable and ephemeral, and the legacy of an empire is measured not only in territory or wealth but in enduring contributions to culture, knowledge, and human connection. In reflecting on the rise and fall of the forgotten empire, we glimpse the complexity and beauty of human civilization. We see how ambition, ingenuity, and courage can craft networks that span continents and generations, connecting people, ideas, and goods in ways that redefine possibility. We also see how delicacy, balance, and adaptability are essential to sustain achievement, and how even the most brilliant accomplishments can be challenged by unforeseen pressures. The Silk Road, with its caravan cities, nomadic guides, temples, and markets, remains a testament to this intricate dance between creation and impermanence, prosperity and fragility. Ultimately, the forgotten empire's legacy is timeless. It teaches us that history is not only shaped by rulers or armies but by the networks of commerce, knowledge, and human connection that bind societies together. It reminds us that prosperity requires foresight, resilience, and collaboration. And above all, it reveals that even in decline, the echoes of a civilization's vision can persist, influencing cultures, economies, and human thought for centuries beyond its political lifespan. The rise, apex, and fragile threads of decline of this empire offer a story both cautionary and inspiring, a story of human ambition, ingenuity, and the enduring pursuit of connection across space, time, and the vast, open landscapes of history.